Wonderful. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Worth, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Quorum, and really excited to take some time this afternoon to talk about how to take your public affairs strategy online. We've got 5 big ideas and 5 case studies to match up with those ideas for you all today, and then most certainly we'll have time for questions at the end. But feel free, as you've got questions that come up about a variety of strategies, feel free to just bring your mouse down to the bottom and click on the Q&A tab and put your questions right into Q&A, which will be the easiest place for me to see them at the end. So the high level of where we're coming from with this presentation is really the realization that I think many of us have had over the last month to 2 months is that we are facing what is a very likely to be a long-term public health crisis. Not only is that going to mean that our socially distant world is going to continue for much longer than we had initially thought when it all started in the US in March, but rather, in addition to that, that's going to have a fair amount of impacts as we think about advocacy and public and government affairs. So 3 kind of big things that make sure that you should be thinking about, and I'm sure many of you already are. But the first one is a frequent reopening and closing of states and cities. I think we're already starting to see this a little bit with some conversations happening about, is there either a delay in reopenings, or at what point would either city, county, state have to decide that they're going to go back and close again. Obviously, that's not something that we want, but it is important that elected officials are thinking about the larger term public health interests. And if either we see a very significant increase over the course of the next couple of months or see a second wave in the fall, I think it's something that we have to be thinking about happening and be prepared to address. The second piece of this is extremely limited and no in-person access to elected officials. So as many folks have likely seen and witnessed, almost everything is happening now by Zoom and telephone. Gone are the days of just simply being able to pop into an office on Capitol Hill and ask to go sit down with the LA or the staffer that works on the particular issue, let alone access to the elected officials themselves. And I think one of the interesting trends that the Public Affairs Council saw in a recent poll they did of 245 executives is that the majority of them think that the number of in-person meetings is going to be dramatically decreased even after the pandemic is over. So I look at this as okay, we have 6 months to a year and a half, maybe more of this, where we have limited or no in-person meetings. But realizing that once the pandemic is over, we're going to be seeing that trend likely continue because it's changing the way that we all work. And then the last piece of it is just a realization of canceled events and conferences. So I'm someone who used to be on an airplane every single week, and I have been on an airplane once in the last 3.5 months. So very much seeing that all of the events are canceled, all the conferences are canceled, and there go those casual opportunities to bump into state legislators, have conversations with staff, ask how things are going on. And given that, realize that all of this, engagement strategies have to change. And so the big message that we have for you all today and that we've been sharing with all of our clients and potential clients is that there is a massive need to go digital, unlike ever before. And so what we did here with this presentation and this deck is put together 5 strategies on how best to do it. So the first one of those is that it has become absolutely essential to monitor the conversation that is happening on social media and online. There are 7,400 state legislators. Of those, 50% of them are on Twitter and 75% are on Facebook. And those elected officials are sitting there just like we all are, in a world where they're not able to go out and go do handshakes and events and meet and greets, and wanting to make sure that they get reelected, many of them come this fall, but also that they stay front in mind of their constituents. And so what are they doing? They're taking all the conversation online. This is a major trend that we've seen happen over the course of really the last 10 years since these platforms have been introduced, and it's just dramatically accelerated because it has now become a significant communications tool for the elected officials. And it makes sense because on the other side of that, their constituents are also at home bored, looking for things to do. And what are they doing? Like many of us, spending much more time on social media. The reason why this is important is that suddenly the conversations that were happening, at conferences, at events, on the sidelines, at Q&A sessions with constituents are now all happening online, which means that your issues are likely being talked about by legislators, not to mention the name of your organization, your company, your trade association, as well, of being directly called out. And so that presents a number of needs to be able to really think about engaging. On a purely reactive side, you want to know what people are saying about you, especially when they control whether or not your issue either gets stopped or advanced. In the middle of it, there is engagement opportunities. So maybe it's not related to your issue, but instead of the, hey, I saw you at NCSL, how's your younger son doing? Did they get into college? It becomes oh, here's a tweet that they just put out about how they went fishing this weekend with their younger son. And there's an opportunity for you to say, wow, looks beautiful. Congrats on the great catch. And that also triggers that in-person kind of mental interaction of, oh yeah, I remember that person, and whoa, yeah, they still exist. And then on the other side of it is where there are opportunities to pick up new supporters of people who are talking about your issues that you didn't even realize, or who you have an opportunity to really get them to promote and push out information that advances your cause. And so we'd really encourage, if you're not already, to figure out how you can develop a very robust and comprehensive social media monitoring strategy. We've got a case study on our website from Uber and how they manage rapid response communication. And in talking with Daniel Burr, who's their head of federal government affairs, what's been amazing is since they've had Quorum, they've been able to get information much faster than their communications team in New York gets it, faster than their executives get it. And as a result, they can be much more proactive. So they can send that out to their team and make sure that they're on a response, can send it out to contract lobbyists, to the press team, and then also they can be the ones that brief their executives when something comes up rather than vice versa. And so it's a really interesting case study on, all right, what does it look like when you're actually on top of the dialogue and on top of the conversation? And to just finally kind of wrap up here, the thing to remember is there is a significant amount of it. We're getting about 10,000 statements every single day from Capitol Hill alone. And that's not even including the state and local level where we're also monitoring. And so simply just following a couple people on Twitter, well, great, isn't going to do far enough than actually making sure that you're comprehensively monitoring across it. So that's really best practice number one. If you've got questions, again, drag down, put them into the Q&A below. Would certainly love to answer them at the end. The next best practice comes from thinking about, okay, you're monitoring all these conversations. You know what's happening and going on. How do you actually begin to engage with it? And this is where we would really encourage you to create a policy Twitter account. And so the thought of this is that if you're working for a major nonprofit or a major company, that the normal Twitter account that's associated with the brand, obviously we get the example here of GE, is not necessarily going to be interacting and liking state legislators and mayors' tweets. But instead, you want to create a digital platform where you can actually then engage and say thank you or retweet lawmakers. And that way it directly connects them back to your brand. Hopefully they follow you, and then you get your own distribution platform where you can share information to them right into the individual platform that the legislators are spending time looking at, which Twitter or Facebook, because they want to know what's happening with their constituents and they want to know what's going on in their district. And so this one I just think is a really smart opportunity to be able to highlight some of those additional engagement opportunities that can come. Now, there are a couple schools of thought to this. And we did an interview with Becca Steele at Toyota, who set up the @Toyota policy account. And I think they did it early last spring, if I remember correctly, but went through some of the considerations and things to think about when it comes to, okay, what do you want this account to do? Who's the audience? What's the conversation and what happens? And also, all right, how do you actually think about getting it approved by the corporate communications team or your trade association or nonprofit communications team as well? The other flavor of this is that you can also designate an individual in your organization to be much more of a forward voice and really speak personally. So a great example of this is Jay Simmons over at the National Association of Manufacturers. He's their president, very active on Twitter. He will frequently call out senators, thank senators, be very, very active and engaging. Gary Shapiro, Consumer Technology Association, same way. And then there's some corporate examples. It's interesting, both Walmart and Amazon have adopted this approach. Dan Bartlett, who's the EVP of Corporate Affairs, has a Twitter account. He'll directly engage with senators, both on items that he thinks are very favorable to the company, and also on items where he doesn't think that the senator or elected official is looking at it the right way. And Jay Carney will do the same on Twitter. And essentially, it brings a human element to it. But the big piece of all of this, and this is why there's something of 60 to probably now closer to 80 of these policy Twitter accounts out, is this conversation is happening online. And one thing, you got to make sure you're monitoring it. But second, you need to have a strategy and a plan to engage, because there's a lot of opportunities to either build strong relationships, to make sure that legislators see you, to then actually be able to see the information that comes from it. And then obviously third and finally is to be able to respond when it might be against your interests. So the Public Affairs Council has got a great list of all the policy Twitter accounts that are out there. And this piece from Becca Steele, just highly recommend, because it really takes you into some of the thinking on, all right, what is it like to set one up? The third best practice to share today is to stand out with targeted emails. And this is really important, especially when you can't be in person. So we did a webinar probably 2.5 months ago with Holland and Knight. And they made the point that in the middle of the coronavirus, it really came down to, okay, who actually has relationships, and who, when they call them, goes, oh yeah, that's Spencer calling. I know Spencer, like I'll go and pick that up. And it just speaks to when you can't, again, show up on Capitol Hill or see the person at an event and go talk to the chief of staff, it becomes a lot harder to make sure that you're a known person and that you can break through. But also on the other side of that is many of us, we have hundreds, if not thousands of relationships of people who we've met over the course of the last year. And very likely we keep up with them in state capitals, on Capitol Hill, at events in person, where it's like, oh yeah, I see that person. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge in this new digital world that we are not going to be as present as we possibly could be physically, because we are all sitting in our homes or in our communities and not at events or on airplanes or in areas that would, dramatically possibly increase the spread of this virus. And so the suggestion that we really push here for is to basically set up a targeted email campaign so that your key contacts are hearing from you on a consistent basis. And one, don't forget who you are, but also start to think more positively about the work that your organization is doing. So what this looks like in practice is essentially saying, hey, once a month, go out and send an email with some sort of piece of positive news about the effort that you're working on to your series of key contacts, whether they're chiefs of staff, LAs, LDs, policy influencers. You can do this as well with members of the media or academics, NGO leaders, whatever it might be, and just make sure that they're hearing about the good things that your organization is doing. So a couple examples of this, maybe it could be something as simple as responding to the Black Lives Matter protest. At Quorum, we're taking tomorrow, June 19th, off as a company holiday. And maybe it's letting the elected officials know that you've decided to join that movement as well. It could be something around the 4th of July that's coming up, and the efforts that are being made around citizenship and making sure in civic education. Obviously, in a normal times, we'd be talking about back to school in August and talking about a scholarship program that your organization is affiliated with, or education advocacy efforts. But basically tie it to the current moment that's happening and let people know what you think and what your organization is doing about it. And then they'll kind of consistently see your name and go, yeah, I know Spencer, I get his emails. And oh, by the way, they're doing really good work, so that when you call asking for something, it's not, hi, I wanted to introduce myself because I'm Spencer Launer and I work for X organization. It's, oh yeah, I know who you are. And then the last piece of this, and this is the one that I really love, is you're making sure that your email address and signature is in the inboxes of the elected officials that matter the most. And the reason why that's so important is that when a policymaker is sitting there with a problem, they're not going to go to the contact us form of your nonprofit, your trade association, your company website and say, can I talk to somebody on your government affairs team? No, it's going to be, hey, does anyone know so-and-so at X organization? And the person's going to be like, oh yeah, I think I've got an email for them. Go in and put it in the name of the organization. Up pops your contact email and phone number. And so it creates a really powerful opportunity. So this is a case study from a client of ours, DoorDash, who's got a really great program where they're actually helping with last mile delivery to local and city governments, especially important during the coronavirus times. So for them, An example being of, okay, if you've got seniors all across the community and the city's providing food, how do you get the food from the food depot out to the seniors who obviously are not able to move around? And they launched a new effort that would provide those services at cost. They wouldn't make a profit on them, to cities and counties, and they wanted to get that information out to state and local officials. And so what they did is they pulled up the list and quorum of every state legislator, as well as mayors and city council members, put some filters on it to match their target area and strategy, and then sent it out to a couple thousand people. And it took them, probably 30 minutes to draft the message, 30 minutes to send it, and do such broader outreach than they ever would have been able to do before. And not only does that then introduce all these lawmakers to DoorDash, but also then gives them the contact information of the DoorDash team, so that when they've got questions down the road about any of their policy issues, maybe it's an opportunity to partner with them from a business perspective, or maybe it's a question around independent contractors, they have somebody they can reach out to and be able to engage with. So this is available on the Quorum website and provides a really interesting example of that policy reputation work. Last thing I'll just say here is that this is also really relevant in the event of disasters. And so obviously I've heard the news that we're expecting a pretty significant hurricane season. We'll see a lot of clients who end up using this to send updates out to elected officials in an impacted community, whether it's hurricanes, whether it's flooding, wildfires, and making sure that they're frequently in the loop around, okay, how is an organization responding to, and then that they can go and be able to update their constituents with that. Fourth one is another one of just my absolute favorites, and that's to create a policy reputation calendar. And so this is really just an organizational effort to be able to maintain a consistent message and contact through quarantine. So probably one of the biggest mistakes I'll see our clients make is, hey, we're really excited, we're going to send out this one message, and then they only send out one thing. Or they send out one message and at the same time something else happens on Twitter that then they're responding to, and they're really actually pushing a different bill on Capitol Hill, and by the way, they sponsored an event over on a totally different issue. And so yes, people start to think a little more positively about the organization, but they don't walk away with one consistent message. And this is just literally as simple as put out all 12 months of the year, or think 12 months from today, this June through next July, and pick a theme for each of the months. Now, obviously you can change your theme down the road if you want to, but where is there an opportunity to talk about something significant from both the conversations you have in person with elected officials, in your digital communications through Outbox, on your social channels, obviously in a normal world if you could do an event around it, but essentially get everyone talking on the same topic that likely would be related to one of your issues or an area where you're making a lot of impact. And the benefit of this is that humans need to hear something multiple times for it to break through. So if you just send one tweet out, yeah, I might see it, but I'm going to forget it because I looked at probably 30 other tweets when I was looking at it. But if you send a tweet out, send me an event invite, follow up with an email message about the new report that you released. And oh, by the way, when I see you in person, if the thing, and I say, hey, how are you doing? And you go, oh, I'm doing great. We just released this big new global sustainability report. Here's what we're doing around Earth Day. I go, yeah, I saw it. I got your event invite. And oh, by the way, I also saw it on Twitter. And then that starts to register with me as a human because I've heard it so many times. And so this, I think, is really essential in these times where more information is coming at people than ever before. Screen time is dramatically up just because people are online and needing to hear of it through multiple channels, partners, and places of conversation. And so there is a great example. This is one of the things that Coca-Cola has been doing, is exactly this, to be able to go through and think about, okay, what are the big positive social and corporate sustainability efforts they do, and share that information out. So a couple examples. One, the Earth Day one comes from them. They do a sustainability report every year, and they make an effort that every Earth Day they go and send that report out so that elected officials can see all the sustainability efforts that they're making and doing. Or related to Veterans Day. Oftentimes the foundation makes a fairly considerable contribution to veterans and veterans organizations on Veterans Day. That's an awesome opportunity to be able to share with legislators, hey, here's what we're doing and how we're recognizing this individual event. So a really smart way to be able to put it together. I wrote a blog post on LinkedIn with some different ideas and a sample calendar. And so if you just Google policy reputation calendar, it should pop up. You might also have to put in Alex Worth LinkedIn. And we certainly can make sure that folks get it after this conversation and webinar. So we got one more best practice, but again, a reminder, if you go down bottom left and click Q&A, would love any questions you have. We'll certainly take those in just a minute. But The last one we have is expand your virtual grassroots program. And really, I think there's two major reasons around this. The first is, as we've mentioned, in this digital world, people are spending more time online, which means that they are much more likely to go and take an action or sign up for something and do something than ever before. And there's an opportunity to really take advantage of that if you're looking to build your grassroots advocacy program, because people have more time on their hands, and you're not trying to, in the middle of a kid's soccer game, say, hey, would you be able to interrupt and do this? But rather you're interrupting the middle of, the 30th edition of the nightly news or their favorite TV show. And so that then creates that opportunity to really drive those signups and engagement. But on the other side is that members of Congress and state and local elected officials are dying to hear from their constituents. They are not actually hearing from these individuals on a frequent basis because they're not seeing them out and about. And so they're really looking for those email connections. And then also as well want to be able to respond and show that they're engaging and working with those constituents. And when you think about that, one, great opportunity to be able to take advantage and put your issues in and get people to be talking about them. But also then on the other side of it is just a realization that you're having less contact and less engagement with these elected officials. And so engaging virtually is going to be one of the better ways to be able to reach out. And I think it's important when you think about doing this with a breadth of actions, of being able to write your member of Congress, being able to do story banking and share information, being able to go and send a tweet or just share an article on Facebook and Twitter. Those are all really fantastic areas through which there then become the chance to engage further with those elected officials. And so this is a case study from the Airline Pilots Association, who ran a multi-channel grassroots campaign. And they ran head-on into some of the COVID challenges, the fact that they were looking at passing stimulus relief over a weekend and realizing that, look, you gotta be able to put everything down. So not only were they actually going and doing efforts where they were actually, writing members of Congress and calling, but they realized that if you call, that's not going to work on a weekend, let alone if no one's in the office. And then transitioning over to, hey, we need to be doing a Twitter campaign and sharing and pushing this out. And I think one of the consistent themes that we've heard so far from our clients is that grassroots advocacy messages are through the roof. We're seeing much greater engagement, way more messages sent, because people both have more time on their hands, but also really see the impact that they can make. And so the big thing that we would just encourage all of you to do is realize that there is a window and a moment here. Things are changing and shifting, and there's a big opportunity and need to take advantage of that. So those are my 5 super quick tips of things to think about with 5 case studies to back it up about how the world is changing. And I think it is really important that we all acknowledge that we're sitting in the midst of this change as a public affairs industry. And that both, unfortunately, we've got a long road ahead before things get back to how we're used to them being or more quote unquote normal. And then the even bigger realization that the new normal is going to look a lot different, and we're going to see changes happening. And I'm very confident that if you implement, 2, 3, 4, even 5 of these strategies, it will help you as an organization to be better positioned in this digital world and make sure that you're ready for the changes to come, let alone to be able to really fully engage in the world that we're currently living in. So with that, would love to open it up and take some questions. Again, bottom left, if you put in Q&A, would certainly love any questions that come up. So lots of questions. I'm looking up at a screen up here as Satya is sharing a couple with me. The first is, should a policy reputation calendar also specify stakeholders for receiving the message? 100% agree with this, that it is a great opportunity to go in and say, okay, here's who we're communicating to at the given time. The thought with the policy reputation calendar is you can get very specific with the messages, but also would encourage you to think about, are there things that could be more relevant to a broader series of stakeholders? And realizing that you want to be comfortable with what you put on Twitter with the media seeing the same way that an academic might see it, the same way that somebody else who's a legislative staffer or related to a legislative staffer might see it. So yes, you can specify, certainly a good thing to do, but again, it's the repetition that really makes the impact, because one email, everyone's going to go, okay, interesting. But it's the consistent emails where even if you haven't met someone in person, you feel like you start to know them from reading those emails. What types of grassroots campaigns are you finding to be most successful in COVID? So a couple that I really like. One, the Twitter campaigns are awesome. Members of Congress are looking at that online engagement. You bet, especially as we get more and more members of Congress that are more social media literate, they're spending more time, they've got the login to their Twitter. And it's just a really good opportunity to be able to put tweets front and center to legislators. The other one that I really love is a Share Your Story campaign. And so realizing that, okay, it might be a little harder to get a message to members of Congress office. I think they've gotten better at being able to fully access their constituent management tools. But if you collect that story bank and have a huge series of stories about how your organization or your members or your employees have been impacted by COVID, you can turn that over to your lobbying team and they can go take that and say, well, let me tell you the story about this person in your district. And that's just a really smart generic campaign going along. And then the last thing I would say is very much would defer to write your member of Congress campaigns. It is much easier for people to log in online and be able to see what's happening and going on in their constituent management system. We've heard of some stories about individual offices having voicemails full, nobody picking up the phone, things just going to voicemail. So pushing people to call, I think, is a little bit harder just given the work from home environment, but there's certainly a lot of other really good engagement opportunities. What do you recommend for folks that are new to this field and don't already have relationships built up? Are cold emails the best way to go? So in the digital world, yes, it's definitely harder when you don't have relationships because, again, what used to happen, you used to go to events and meet people, walk into offices and introduce yourself. I do think that cold emails are a really great way to do it. And it's interesting because we see this with folks that want to partner with Quorum and that are not clients or potential clients, but want us to purchase some sort of software or services from them. And they'll reach out and they'll stay up and really try and be helpful and present. And so even if you ignore them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, as long as it's good natured and it's not every day or every week, but if you think about once a month, they're going to start to put and say, oh yeah, that's really a connection. And there's a great book out there that Adam Grant wrote, who's a professor at Wharton, does a lot of psychology thinking about give and take. It's called Give or Take. And it's about, there's 3 types of people in the world: givers, matchers, and takers. Givers are people that create so much goodwill because they're constantly trying to help out. Matchers are, hey, if you do this one thing for me, I'll do this one thing for you. And takers are, can you? And I wrote another post about how one of the challenges with public affairs is oftentimes it forces everyone into a taker mentality. Would you amend this bill? Could you just do this? Could you just do Y? And I think a big thing to think about is how can you as an individual, whether you have relationships or not, move from the asking elected officials to figure out how you can help them. And so something as simple as, hey, do you have a call? Would love to understand what you're working on and how my organization might be able to help you, get you in the door, versus, hey, I would love to brief you about this bill that I really want to have happen. And so for those folks that don't have pre-existing relationships built up, I think that's a wonderful way to really approach it from giving and thinking about how to help, and doing that through cold email. And even if you don't get a response the first time, follow up with a little thing and say, hey, I saw your post on X. Have you thought about Y? Or could I introduce you to this person who I think would be really helpful? And also, don't forget the online. If they put it online, go and retweet or like the post. Figure out if the staffers are on social media and engage and connect with them on Twitter when they're sharing information. But you can start to really then build those relationships. Next question that we have is, for the targeted monthly emails, do you recommend sending those out from personal email or utilizing an organization's email system, maybe a combo? So very much recommend that you send it from your work address. I think it's harder when you come from an Outlook or a Gmail and it's sending out and saying, hey, here's the update that's happening. This really is meant to lean into a little bit more of a professional approach where you are sharing this update on behalf of the organization. And so maybe, there's a major moment of like, hey, we're based in Atlanta and the Falcons just won the Super Bowl and we're so excited we want to share, that it makes sense to pull in some more of that personal. But it's meant to highlight the work of your organization and what your organization is doing. And so should come from your corporate or organization email. There's a lot of ways you can do it. You can do it through BCC, which can be a little bit harder. You also have to be careful about the firewalls on Capitol Hill. Just because when you BCC, all the emails get sent at once, and sometimes they go, oh, yikes, possibly mass email. But there are systems like Quorum and others that can actually authenticate in with your organization's domain, and so can let you send those emails in mass, where we stagger them by milliseconds, so it helps break through the firewall on Capitol Hill, but then also gives the impression that you took all the time to go in individually, one by one, and reach out to individuals. Next question that we got is, how often should you be engaging with folks with your Twitter account? What's the balance between response and putting out unique content? So I think guidance on Twitter ends up being a little bit more difficult, just because there's so many tweets that are out there. And so literally, unless you're tweeting every single hour, I think it's going to be really hard for you to put out too much on Twitter. I think if you're putting out a post a day, it works perfectly fine. You do want people to really be hearing from the organization. So retweeting a lot of tweets that don't mention the organization with a policy Twitter account, I don't think is the best strategy, just because you're promoting other people. Retweeting legislators and elected officials who are saying things that you like, awesome. Because then everyone else who's following you goes, wow, they've got a lot of support. And it seems to be natural too, of people who care about their issue. And then taking the time, and there's some really great examples when you go look at, what GE or Toyota or Walmart action or, Amazon policy have done, where, they'll talk about engagement with elected officials. I saw an example from Fidelity yesterday where they had 3 governors talking to their employees. They just put out a simple thank you tweet of, thank you to these 3 governors for sitting down with the CEO. And I sit there and go, wow, Fidelity got 3 governors of 3 different states to sit on a Zoom together and talk to their team members. Like, that's really significant. And then elected officials also see that and go, wow, those folks are really connected. They have sway, and, elected officials want to be associated with them. And like all humans, we want to be, both with what's popular and where they're people. And so showing that momentum, I think, ends up being really successful. But as long as you're not tweeting, more than like 5 times a day, which is even a bit much, I think it's really hard to go wrong. Next question, have you seen any ways that organizations have creatively expanded the basic webinar that is attention grabbing for policymakers and staff? So this is a great question. Where this comes from is we're seeing this awesome new strategy where organizations will send out an email and say, hey, come join us on this webinar and webinar conversation. And what we've heard from our clients is getting really good responses where individuals are looking for more information, whether it be about what's happening in economic policy in the world, what's going on an issue, a briefing around health, and looking for access to experts and being able to join and engage in a virtual way much more than they have before. And so I think, we're certainly, I don't think we're seeing, a tremendous amount of that occurring. We're seeing a good chunk, and we would encourage more because it's a really great engagement opportunity. The example that I think of from more of the private sector in the technology world, one of the things that we're seeing is a lot more of roundtable conversations on issues. And so thinking about your webinar approach, great, it's spread out to lots of people, get lots of folks on, but can you engage folks in a smaller roundtable and be able to bring 10 people in and say, hey, we want to have a conversation on this issue. And what people are looking for is they're looking for those connections. Because in the past, they all used to go to the same briefing on the same issue and they talk to their fellow LAs there. But if somebody isn't there coordinating and saying, hey, we're going to talk about infrastructure, let's bring together 10 LAs from 10 offices, that networking connection doesn't actually happen. And so I think there's an actually even greater role for all of the organizations to play as a convening center in this digital world, because those natural and in-person interactions are not happening the way they used to. And so while it may seem a little more awkward to say, hey, we're going to do a forced roundtable or a conversation, you're going to see really excellent engagement. And then suddenly you're sitting there, the host of the conversation that's happening on infrastructure, not to mention the chance to build a relationship. And so those are great things as we tie it back, one, to send out via outbox and email invitations, but then also to tie into your policy reputation calendar to say, hey, we're talking this month about July 4th and civic education. Like, let's maintain a little roundtable around that, bring some LAs together to talk about it. And yeah, maybe it's one of your key issues, maybe not, but those LAs are probably going to cover other items and other issues and portfolios. And so there's a chance to start to build a relationship with them, and they'll walk away and be really appreciative of that. Next question, similarly, should the monthly emails come from a person versus the public affairs office? So highly recommend that you send them in someone's name. And the reason for that is that the technology now is so good that you can give the impression that one person went in and took time to individually write 1,000 people all at once. If you say public affairs office, people go, oh, another email, like delete. Where if it's like, oh, Satya took the time to email me, like, wow, that was really kind and thoughtful of her. I'll never forget, I was at a holiday party probably a year and a half ago. Somebody had used the outbox tool to send out a message. And somebody comes up and they say, hey, do you know where Kevin is? And I'm like, oh, you mean Kevin, I mentioned the last time. Yes, he sent me an email. I was like, oh, interesting. Do you know him? She's like, no, but he invited me to this, and I really want to go and say thank you to him for doing it and personally inviting me. And, I kind of smiled and said, yeah, he's up that way. But that person had such a direct connection that came from the fact that they received an email. And that's where we'd really encourage folks to take it a step further. And this is a relatively new feature that we put into Quorum, but is a single sender where you assign someone to your team to each of your key stakeholders. So some people might take House Dems, some House Rs, some Senate Dems, some Senate Rs, 4 people. And then for each of those 4 folks, they send the same message out to their stakeholders, different groups. Obviously, they could tweak it a little if they wanted to. And then they hear from all of them with a dedicated point of contact. And that means that you can have one person in the organization focus on sending the email and crafting it, and then suddenly have that impact spread across the whole organization. And I know of a major company who has this for their whole external affairs team, where their entire external affairs team each has a set of stakeholders they're responsible for, and they literally have a one-click send. So if there's a major company announcement they need to send out, press one click, and every person hears from every stakeholder hears from their point of contact to the company with the good news or the message they want to get out. And you can segment by region and by title and issue and a whole series of other items, but it becomes really powerful in being able to go and share it forward. Next question is a fun one. What do you think about how your recommendations work in the EU? Do we have good examples from Europe? So this is a really excellent question. And I think there's a couple sides of it. I asked head of government affairs when I was in Brussels, I think it was last spring, of how really is different between the United States and the European Union when it comes to public policy. And what he said will always stick with me is like, you folks in the United States are so obsessed with killing legislation and killing bills. In the European Union, once something's a piece of legislation, it is long gone. You can't stop it unless something significant shifts. In the EU, you have to kill an idea. And that I thought was so profound and speaks a little bit to this digital advocacy strategy, because you literally have to shape the conversation that happens before it gets to legislation. And that means that if somebody starts talking about something on Twitter, that is as much of a threat in the EU as it is somebody introducing a bill in the United States. And then vice versa is, how do you insert your ideas into the public policy debate so that the draft piece of legislation actually reflects the white paper that your organization put together? And so I think there's huge opportunities to take the digital approach into the EU and really work on the how do you shape ideas. The piece of it that's obviously a little bit harder is with GDPR, you do have to be careful about who you're reaching out to and making sure you have a lawful basis of processing. It's part of the reason why at Quorum, we have a Brussels office who is focused on making sure that we are completely GDPR compliant. But the biggest thing to recognize is that elected officials are exempt from the GDPR and if there's a public interest exception. And so if you're sharing information with elected officials in the public interest, you have the right to be able to email them. But you do have to be careful if you're reaching out to, say, a member of the media or a stakeholder who's not a government official, and be thoughtful there. But many of these same ideas apply. The one that is not necessarily as frequent in the EU is grassroots advocacy. They just have not adopted it near the same amount that's happened in the US. And I think a large part of that is just because of how the system is set up with so many member countries, and then obviously with the European Council being such a close hold on power. So that's really the most cutting edge. But the idea piece of it really is real, and you'll see organizations in the EU who also take an approach and have an EU policy Twitter account. Coca-Cola is a great example of that. They have Coca-Cola EU policy and are just focused on engaging with elected officials in government. A great question. I have not mentioned Instagram, not a useful part of a public policy campaign. So Instagram, fascinating from perspective. There's about 290 members of Congress as of middle of last year who had an Instagram account. So I think that's even higher. So I think it's fair to say something like 70% to 75% of members of Congress are on Instagram. And one of the things that I see just from following some of them is that it's actually the members themselves that are really doing the Instas in many cases, where they are, posting photos. Kevin McCarthy is one of my favorites, posting photos of himself and his dog on the couch. Like, I find it hard to believe that he's taking a photo and sending it to his staffer being like, hey, go post it. In the same way that, he posts that photo of the dog and suddenly Elise Stefanik likes it. Like, I have a feeling, obviously he and Elise Stefanik are close, but I have a feeling that they're actually the ones that are interacting on the platform. So with the Quorum platform, we certainly are monitoring Instagram, and we have the ability to go in and search for text. What becomes harder with that is then finding the opportunities to engage. So you can't do grassroots advocacy into Instagram. It's got a very closed development environment that limits a lot of the external integrations that any technology platform can do with it. But you certainly could create an Instagram account that you could go and comment or engage on the platform. The thought that I have about it is it ends up being a lot more personal. So it's an opportunity where if you have your own brand, you should be commenting on your own Instagram that's public and you're comfortable with people seeing, commenting on, Kevin McCarthy or Congresswoman Stefanik's Instagram, because they'll see it and that repetition will come up. But if you're doing it from a corporate account, I think, or an organization account, I think it gets to be a little more business professional, and that I really feel is more on Twitter than just on Instagram alone. So, but definitely valuable, and we're seeing a lot more with it. I believe that is all of the questions. I'm just going to double check. If you've got more, certainly feel free to send them in. But have really enjoyed this conversation. I'm not seeing any more of them, and Satya is telling me that it's all of them. So high level on this, we have this presentation in deck. There'll be a quick survey here at the end. If you fill that out, we'll make sure that we'll send the deck to you. All of it is linked to case studies so you can read further. Also, a member of our team is more than happy to talk further about how some of these might apply to your organization and brainstorm with you. But really, the goal of this is to highlight that we're in a major change and shift in our world, and we need to start thinking about what can we be doing to change and adapt ourselves to that change. These are certainly the 5 best ideas that I've got. But if there's more, my email's alex@quorum.us. Would love to hear about some of the best-in-class things you're doing. And obviously, if there's a moment to educate others on that, that's certainly what we're in the business of doing. So with that, thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.